Alrighty. Hello, friends. I'm Ava or Pistachio, and I am co-leading the implicit bias in counselor selection process training. Um, so a little bit about me is I'm one of the many program coordinators that you might have worked with or have met this weekend or throughout your time at Kesem. I come from Santa Clara University where I studied marketing. So if you also have any AMP questions, hit me up. I love that stuff. Um, and I am passionate about this session because choosing the counselors really lays the foundation for a rockstar camp. You all have the power to train, select, encourage, foster community, all of the things, and that all creates a super inclusive and equitable environment at camp that we are striving to make better every day. So that is why I'm here. And then I'm co-leading with Dobby.
Hello, everyone. Like Sasha said, I am Dobby. I use he, him, his pronouns. I am also a program coordinator. I graduated from Western University in 2020 with my degree in psychology. And similar to Pistachio, I'm really passionate about this session because, our goal is to take the most qualified humans, the best people possible to camp. And we want to make sure that our counselors actually reflect the way that our campers look. So we want to make sure that we're doing that and we're kind of breaking down those barriers and bringing the absolute best people to camp possible for our campers. So thank you for watching this recording. Wish you all were in person at Summit to do this session with us, but we're going to jump right in. So if you all were attending in person, we would be doing an activity right off the bat called the tag game. And this activity would include you all receiving an index card. And on that index card would have some variety of the following. It would have 1, 2, or 3 shapes of the same shape. So square, circle, triangle, all the things. And then those shapes would also be a certain color. So you might have like 3 orange squares. Somebody else might have 2 purple triangles, that type of vibe. And then once we're all in there, once we do introductions, you all will be instructed to just organize yourselves based on your card. So, obviously without talking. So you can't talk to each other. You'd have to organize yourselves based on where you think you would fit. And some of you might, group yourselves based on like the shape that you have. So all the squares are together, regardless of how many squares you have. Some of you might think, basing yourselves and organize yourself based on like the color of the shape. So all the purple shapes are together, all the orange shapes are together, thing like that. Maybe even like the number of shapes that you have. So all the index cards that have the 3 shapes would be together and 2 shapes and 1 shape. But what you don't know is that there are a handful of individuals who have very unique shapes on their cards. So someone might have like a purple star, and obviously there are no other stars in the group. Someone might have a yellow smiley face, and there are no other smiley faces in the group. So like, where do those people group themselves, right? So the point of this activity is mainly for you all to understand and realize that we should not group ourselves based on physical characteristics. And B, you all could have just grouped yourself as one big large group, because we didn't say like organize yourself based on the characteristics of your card. We just said organize yourselves, right? And so that's kind of the aha moment of the activity, if you would have been in person, to really set up this training of implicit biases and how we automatically make those adjustments because we want to fit into a group. And when we look at that card, we see color and we see shape, and we automatically say, I belong only with those colors or those shapes. And that's simply just not true. So I'm going to pass it over to Pistachio for a little bit of a mindset check before we jump into this training.
Amazing. Yeah, so hopefully that was helpful getting you in the mood to learn about implicit bias and the counselor selection process. But why is the session important? You might be asking yourself. So the session is important because the most important aspect of volunteer selection is choosing individuals that will support our campers and families for the best of our chapter ability. A barrier with selecting these individuals is implicit bias, which we are going to work through and break down. And then that is what we hope to leave you with. What you can take away from this is being able to start thinking more deeply about implicit biases you might be holding, your chapter might be holding, and how you can work to break down those barriers. And then how it shows up in the counselor selection process and recruitment. And then also before we get started, I want to invite you to learn, listen, and be vulnerable in this space. You are here to reflect and grow from this session. We are all at different starting points with different knowledge levels about these topics. And so wherever you are at is a-okay. And I encourage you to ask questions to your team, to your program coordinator when you start this process more deeply. And just note that when you work with your team, do it with grace and kindness, because your team members might be in a different spot too.
Love that. Just want to retweet what Pistachio said too. Even as program coordinators, we're also still learning, right? And so, this training is not going to be all inclusive of what implicit biases are and what they mean. So we're still learning, we're still growing. Kesem's still learning, Kesem's still growing. We're all still improving in this space as well. Yeah. Amazing. So we are going to talk about a guide or a resource. Kesem loves our resources that you all have access to in the central resources table. And that resource is called the Volunteer Guide, Counselor Applications, Interviews, and Selection. So that's going to be your all-encompassing guide to all of that, the whole entire process for selecting your counselors. Pulling directly from that resource, I have a quote. And it talks specifically about implicit biases. And it says, implicit biases are the automatic mental shortcuts used to process information and make decisions quickly. They also can prevent individuals from making the best decisions and the most objective decisions rather than those decisions we automatically make based on what we see and what we hear. They can cause people to overlook great ideas, certain people, great people for certain positions. And they ultimately create a less than ideal work experience for each other. Typically, they are, it refers to the attitudes or stereotypes that affect our understanding, actions, and decisions in a given interaction. So kind of like tying back into the activity that we talked about earlier, where we automatically made those decisions, right? We automatically saw other people who had the same shape or the same color, and we said, I obviously belong to that group, right? And so those are the automatic things that our brain does. That is what implicit biases refer to. So first question for you all to think about and reflect are, what are the most common implicit biases? So we'd love for you to pause this video and think about what those are to you and what they mean. And then we'll circle back with a discussion after that. All right. Well, welcome back. Thanks for pausing. And we wanted to highlight some of these biases that hopefully you had most of them on your list, and we'll go over a few that maybe you didn't have as well. So the most common that we also have provided for you are those biases around gender, race, sexuality, ageism, ableism, and appearance. So those are the most common that you probably did have written down. We wanted to highlight a few that maybe you didn't have on your list, just so you're aware of them, that we also believe are pretty prevalent in the Kesem space. The first one is name bias. This is when the tendency to prefer certain names over others. So for example, when you're doing, counselor application review, when you actually can't see the person in front of you, you're just looking at them on paper and you come across a name that is maybe unfamiliar to you, or you can't pronounce the name. And then you have somebody else who you do know the name. It's a very common name. A lot of times we tend to prefer the names that are more familiar to us, that we are more comfortable with. The halo effect is when you have the overall positive impression of someone based solely on a quality or trait. So for example, let's say that someone who applied for a job went to a really prestigious school. We automatically elevate them on a pedestal, even though somebody else who did not go to that same school, that same prestigious school, has the same qualities as this person as well. Confirmation bias is when you are actively working to find information from someone to confirm a view or belief of that individual. So you look at them, you think that they are probably a really great counselor. So in their interview, you're really only listening and choosing to type down the things that make them seem like a really qualified candidate, rather than typing the whole situation. And then finally, affinity bias or similarity bias. This is the tendency to favor an individual based on the similarity between the two of you. So between you and the individual. Example here, again, someone's applying for a job or a position, and the person who's doing the hiring went to the same university as them. That's automatically affinity bias. They're probably going to have a little bit more of an advantage over someone who went to a different university. So those are those definitions. We went through more of the complex ones. Hopefully you knew about them. If not, that's totally fine too. Now you do. If you have further questions on them, please reach out to your program coordinator or your directors, and do your own research too, right? If you're still unfamiliar. Something that we do want to point out here, though, we want to make sure you are aware is that, we obviously understand how implicit biases negatively impact an individual, right? So if we have two people who are, applying for the same thing, sometimes our implicit biases automatically lower the chances of one person getting that job. But also with that same bias, the other person over here who does not fall under that implicit bias is also raised up, right? So the gap itself is not just this person being lowered. Because of the implicit bias, this person's also being raised on a pedestal. And so the discrepancy between the two is actually it's actually much bigger than we actually are able to think about, right? So it's really important that we have that in our mind when we go through our counselor interviews, selections, and application reviews.
Great. Thanks so much for those definitions and call outs. Super, super important stuff to think about. So with all of that in mind, what I invite you to do is think about how these biases show up in Kesem and what you can do to combat them. Dobby just gave us tons of ideas and tons of stuff to think on. So maybe expand on that list on how they show up. But pause the video for a few moments, write down your ideas on how they show up in Kesem and what you can do to combat them. Okay, so now that you've hopefully unpaused the video and are back, I'm gonna share my thoughts, our thoughts. So one thing to call out is our recruitment methods for how we even get people to learn about Kesem on our campuses and our community. Maybe you table in the same spot every week on campus and you're only kind of collecting those same people that walk through that use the dining hall, that have a dining plan. Maybe not everybody has a dining plan and you're totally missing that group of people on campus to even join Kesem. Maybe you're recruiting from the same clubs and organizations. Maybe a ton of your members come from the same fraternity or sorority, and so everybody in Kesem ends up being from that fraternity or sorority, and we are totally missing every other group on campus. But we have enough counselors, so why keep going, right? No, keep going anyways. We want to make sure that our folks are like being able to connect with our campers. You can work with your outreach coordinators to see your camper demographics and maybe overlay that with your campus demographics and seeing what you can do to better create a match. And be thinking about those barriers of why people are joining. Another thing that might come up is fundraising expectations or requirements. How do you talk about money? Money is scary and intimidating to a lot of folks. And to some folks, it's no big deal at all. And if they can raise the requirement, easy peasy. So being intentional with how you talk about fundraising and maybe working with your development coordinators on creating a safe space in meetings. And then in the actual selection process and interviews, I want to call out that confirmation bias or cherry picking, where maybe you are interpreting what they're saying in a way that's not exactly what they're saying. Maybe you really want this person to be on your team, and so you're manipulating what they're saying a little bit to best fit what you want to hear. I know I do that, and I don't even realize I'm doing it, and I try to catch myself. So that is something I'm personally trying to work on a bit better. The other thing is like name bias for interviews, offering somebody an interview just because like maybe that is a barrier that you're not even realizing you're doing. And seniority and age of, oh, well, they're a senior, they've been to camp, they're going to be a good counselor, we have to accept them. If you have a newbie that's just as qualified, maybe you really need to compare the two counselors a bit better and see if it is that easy choice. It's probably not an easy choice. You can't just say, oh, they're a senior, we're accepting them. And then one other thing too of maybe like you write off people just because they don't live in the city that you're located in, or they have to travel into your campsite every summer. So you're like, why would they want to join? They have to fly from their home state to camp. Like they're not going to want to do that. they totally could want to do that. You don't have to write them off because of that. So these are all good things to be thinking about. Jobby, did I miss anything to add to this list off the top of your head?
No, yeah, it was great. Thank you for sharing. I did have to go on mute because Luigi, my dog, was barking. So I had to quickly go on mute so he did not interrupt you. But yeah, I think it was great. I really just want to call out to the seniority one. I think we automatically put people who have been to camp on a pedestal because they just have that experience and we want them so badly to be the best. But I really encourage you to really look up the two people and think who's best to go for our campers and who's best to go for our chapter, right? Again, sometimes that is going to be the person who's been to camp before who is going to be a graduating senior. But sometimes that's going to be someone who's brand new to Kesem who they just haven't been given the chance to shine. So really keep that in mind as you're going through this process.
Yeah, great call out. And two, tying into you as directors and volunteer coordinators are going to be the ones doing the majority of the interviewing. Don't interview your friends. That's really hard to like knock down all of your barriers and biases to these people. And so if somebody on your team is less familiar with this person, asking if they can do the interview instead of you could be good. I know I always made it a point to never interview my roommates because I love them. Of course I do. I live with them, right? But that can be another thing to be thinking about of who's doing the interviewing and why. So hopefully that was a lot to ponder and think on and add to your lists. But we're going to move on to a new activity called the Circle of Trust. So if you could take out your note paper or your computer notes, whatever you've been taking notes on, make sure that's in front of you. And I would like you to write down the name or the initials of 3 people that you trust that are not family members. So take a moment, think of 3 people that you really trust that are not family members. Okay. And so once you have those, I'm going to read out some attributes and I want you to put a check mark next to the initials of the person you wrote down if you share the same attribute as them. For example, if you and someone you wrote down share the same gender identity, you would put a check mark next to their initial. So let's start with that, gender identity. Okay, race, age, plus or minus 2 years. We can give a little buffer. Language. Do you speak the same languages? Education. Maybe they're at the same school, major, same program, or same education level.
Love that.
Sexuality. And ability. That could be physical or maybe any learning ability differences. Okay. So I want you to look at your paper and think about where your check marks laid. If you have a lot for one person, if you have the same amount for all of your folks, why you think those check marks are where they're at. And as you're thinking about that, I want to call out affinity bias again, or the like me bias. We have a tendency to prefer people who are similar to us or who are in group. Typically, not only do we trust people in our in group, but we typically have a more positive thought and beliefs towards them when compared to out group members. This can have an impact on how we conduct counselor interviews and make selections. This is why it's super important to use the resources we provide, since our grading systems try to really look at the facts rather than look at the feelings. So hopefully this like me activity or circle of trust activity, you can think about when you are doing your grading or your counselor selection process.
I love that. Thank you, Pistachio, for leading us in that activity. And that's a great segue into the resources that we do have for you. Like Pistachio was saying, these resources are required when we're going through the counselor, review and selection and interview process, because it really helps kind of take out the biases, right? Take out those implicit biases because we're trying to score people objectively based on their skills and qualities, right? Are they qualified to go to camp as a counselor? Are they the most qualified? If not, maybe they shouldn't be going, right? And so these resources have been adjusted year after year to make sure that they are the most up to date that they can be, and making sure we are combating those implicit biases. So we're now going to walk through some of these resources. I am going to share my screen, and Pistachio, if you can just give me a thumbs up if you can see my screen, that would be great. Okay, perfect. So this here, so sorry for the fast scroll. This here is the overall guide to counselor applications, interviews, and selection guide, right? So this is going to be your best friend during this process. So many things are linked here at the top. It'll walk you through all the things that you need for this process, including the training with your program coordinator. It is required before you start this process. But we're going to jump around a little bit to, first of all, this here, which is the counselor application review summary, right? So I'm going to open it up in another window, but it is linked in this guide for you. So this should not, if you were here last year, this should not be unfamiliar to you. It is the same thing that we have been using, or at least this past year. And this is what helps you score people, right? Scores them through their application, through their interview. And then ultimately, this is what you will share along with the interview templates for each person with your program coordinator to get approval before you send out decisions for every single person, right? So this first tab here is when you are reviewing the application itself. So someone applies in Kesem Central, you obviously will copy and paste their name over, and then you will go through and you will answer these questions, fill this out based on what they put in their application, right? So for example, let's go to enthusiasm, right? It talks about how you should score each of these people based on what their response was for that question on the application. And it walks you through one score of 1 to a score of 5 objectively, right? Either they are enthusiastic, demonstrated for the key part of the role, working with campers, supporting the mission, all the things. That's a 5. All the way down to there is no enthusiasm. They did not come to anything all year long. There is no enthusiasm around the role or anything like that. So it's pretty objective on how you score them, right? Now, something to consider though is, what does it mean to be enthusiastic about the role, right? Enthusiasm might look differently based on whoever we're scoring, right? So, some people who are really super outgoing and super, extroverted, their enthusiasm might look a lot different than someone who is less extroverted. So that's something to consider too, right? How are we going to gauge enthusiasm for this role? As well as like if Pistachio and I are the ones reviewing this application, enthusiasm might look differently to me than it looks like to Pistachio. So someone who Pistachio scores as a 5 in enthusiasm, I might be thinking, oof, they're more of a 3 in enthusiasm for me, right? And so it's really important to kind of be meeting with your team to make sure that we are all kind of calibrated and we're gauged on what enthusiasm means for each of these questions, for each of these people who are applying to be a counselor. And we'll go over a few more examples as well. So let's say that we scored this person down here as a 3 for enthusiasm. Another call out here too is team skills, right? So on the application, it's at the questions asked, and then you are going to be scoring their response to that question on their application. Again, applicant has extensive experience being part of a team or leading a team. When I just read that, it sounds pretty obvious as to like what they're looking for. But again, there are so many different ways to be a part of a team or lead a team that look differently based on the person's experiences, right? So for example, being a leader of a sports team in high school, that's a great example. But also being the oldest sibling in a family of 6, that's also being a good example of being a team leader, even though that team is not what we typically think of as a team in this situation, right? Again, same thing here. I encourage you to work with your people who are doing interviews and application reviews to really calibrate yourself before this process starts. I want to call out here too that as you're going through and scoring them, it automatically populates over here the total and the percentage of like out of however many points that they have, right? And then you can mark over here if they were offered an interview or not. Excuse me. So after you do application review, then we are going to shift into the interview process. The The reason we're going over the rubric first is because it's really, really important that you are reviewing the rubric before you go into interviews, right? Sometimes we think interview first and then rubric later, but it's really, really hard to get the people to answer the question the way that you need them to be able to score them appropriately without knowing what they're going to be scored on, right? So if I just go in blindly to an interview with the questions, I can definitely ask the question, but the way that I ask the question might not get the applicant to be answering it in a way that I can actually score them based on this rubric, right? So it's really, really, really important that you spend some time with your team looking over this rubric before the interview actually starts. Similar thing here again, for people you offer an interview, you'll put the name, all the things about them, and then you'll jump right into these questions. A couple of things we want to point out here is that up here at the top under the notes section, these are the questions that are being asked, right? So for experience working with children, this is the question that's going to be asked during the interview. Do you have past experiences working with children? Amazing. We know the question. It's on 2 places. It's on this and the interview template, which we'll go over in a second. Well, they answer their question. How do we possibly score that? So glad you asked, Pistachio. How we score it is down here under question 1. It walks you through scores 1 through 3 and what each of these answers should theoretically score, right? So for example, we ask them the question, do you have past experiences working with children? Based on their answer, I can look here and objectively score them 3, 2, or 1 based on what their response was. So again, a 3 answer might include applicant describes experience working with children in detail and cites sufficient knowledge. Applicant has experience working with children and it can articulate what it was. Amazing. We know exactly what a score of 3 should look like. However, once again, a score of 3 might look so much different between me and Pistachio, right? I might go to an interview and think, oh my goodness, this person, 100% a 3. They have so much experience working with children. And Pistachio might be thinking, I think that's more of a 2. They did a good job, but they didn't do a wonderful job, right? And that's okay. But again, that's why it's really important that we are kind of getting together, calibrating before this process even starts. That way we're all on the same page about what it means to be a 3 for this question. Keep in mind too, again, that experience working with children, answers could totally vary, right? Someone could literally be a camp counselor from high school. That's such relevant experience for this camp counselor job too. But again, someone who has 5 younger siblings also has experience working with children. It just looks a little bit different, right? So you'll do the same thing for each of these questions. You'll ask them the question, you'll come here and you'll see objectively how you should score them based on this criteria here. Another one that I want to point out though too is under conflict management. So this is the question, interpersonal communication skills, blah, blah, all the things, you can read it. It's a pretty long question. So anytime there's a long question like this, we want to make sure that the applicant actually understands what is being asked of them. It's not beneficial to ask a long question and then them have no idea what is even going on. Sometimes that happens to me in interviews, right? We want to make sure like before the interview even starts that we set up a space where they feel comfortable asking for clarification, right? We want them to be able to answer the question based on how we need to score it and have the qualities to score it rather than them not have the qualities only because they were unsure of how the question was being asked, right? Again, want to highlight here as well to get a 3 on this question. It says here, applicant demonstrates strong conflict management and interpersonal communication skills. What are those words, right? Like, obviously we know what they mean, but how are we going to define that in this interview process? Again, strong conflict management and interpersonal communication skills. Those can look so different for each person. And the way that I perceive it is going to be so different than the way that Pistachio perceives it. Okay. So that's, again, for I think the 4th or 5th time, it's super, super important that you are sitting down and dedicating time to go through this before interviews actually start. And then after you have application review and interviews, you will then fill out step 3 here, the summary and decisions for your program coordinator and for you to know as well, like who is being selected. So you'll put all the information here. You will score them. You'll put their score here as well for application and interview. You'll link in their actual interview answers here under this where it says link. You'll put your decision, whether they were selected, waitlisted, or rejected. And then you will review this with your program coordinator, and they will have to go through and approve all the people before you send out selections or rejections. Last thing we need to go over is just the interview itself. So going back to our guide here, interview template. I'm going to click on this. It's going to bring me to the appendix, which we love. Counselor interview template, new applicants, right? As promised, like I said, we have so many resources already made for you. These are required to use. So please, I repeat, please do not create your own rogue interview questions. Oh, not fun, friends. We don't want that, right? If you do that, you can't even use the rubric. And so therefore you have no idea how to score these people, right? So it's really important that you use the templates given to you. Again, it's important that you go through these with your team before you start doing interviews. But I just want to call out that this is already created for you, and all the questions already live in here, and they directly correlate to the rubric based on like the question, what's being asked, and then how you're going to score them on the rubric. We made it. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Pistachio, did I miss anything or have anything else to follow up on that?
Beautiful. Those are all the things that you really do need to do a successful counselor interview. Once you've done all of your recruitment, right? Then that's the fun part of interviewing and selecting. So maybe you might even want to pause for a moment and just take that all in before I give you our final tips and tricks. Because that was a lot. There's a lot of info there. But some stuff, like Dobby and I have both done this as student leaders and then from the PC role. So we have done this a lot. So we have kind of created some tips and tricks for you to really succeed. One thing I want to call out is reviewing counselor selection or counselor applications before offering an interview. Super important. Every school and chapter is a little bit different. So you might be in a space where like you only have 30 applicants, you're accepting 20 people, you can do 30 interviews. That's not too much, right? Where some people might have like 100 counselor applications, and that's a lot. That's a lot of interviews. So paying attention to that counselor application review is going to be really important. So that way you can really use your time wisely and pare down those interviews if you need to. And that's something you can talk with your program coordinator about too, of if you should be offering everybody an interview or if you should be being a bit more selective right out the get-go. Secondly, you all need to have 2 people per interview. We kind of said it as, there's going to be somebody taking notes, but just to really call out the facts, you do need 2 people for each interview. Maybe that's a director and a volunteer coordinator as a pairing, but having 2 people really will help you be able to thoroughly understand their answers and have 2 sets of eyes at the same, like eyes and ears at the same interview. So you are trying to interpret the information as accurately as possible. And then with that, hopefully reviewing your materials beforehand will allow you as an interviewer to ask follow-up questions as needed. Like Dobby was saying, we don't want a misunderstanding of the question to be the reason that they get a low score. But we also don't want our questions to give them the answer in it just because we want them to succeed. Because we want them to succeed. But we also need to make sure we're not telling them like too much information. And kind of feeding the answers to them. So that's something to think about. And that kind of comes with practice too. So maybe talk to your directors who might have done this before, or talk to the volunteer coordinators before you to see how they kind of handled that. And then some tips for you too. Don't schedule back-to-back interviews. You all need a moment to grade those interviews right after you have interviewed the person. So that way everything is pretty fresh on your mind. So giving yourselves maybe 15, 30 minutes between each interview will be a good rule of thumb. It also will give you time to like not have that awkward experience of if you host all of your interviews in the same spot on campus and then you see your next person come up and you're still interviewing the person before them. That's nerve-wracking. So we want to create a safe environment for all of our potential counselors. Secondly, the Google Sheets that Dobby was showing you has how you grade them already integrated into it. Just hover your mouse over those boxes and you'll see your answers pop up to really help guide those grading questions. And then a last call out is you need PC approval before doing anything. We do not want you to have sent out your acceptances or wait lists or rejected without approval, and then you might have to send an email follow up saying, just kidding, we had to change our mind because our program coordinator had, some thoughts more big picture that we didn't have. So please do not send out those acceptances selections before PC approval. Beautiful. And then some following up wrap ups. We are almost done and you are almost fully trained on how to do the things. I want you to think about what's something you learned from this session. Write it down. What's something you learned, maybe something about regarding your own biases, and then maybe regarding the biases that exist in your chapter. And then what is one actionable step you can do now to combat implicit bias during the counselor selection process? If you are with your co's, tell them right now, have that discussion right after this training ends. If you're not with them, send it in an email, text it to them, start these conversations with your team about one thing you can do to combat implicit bias. And then the last thing I want you to do is, let me share my screen, is I want you all to look at this, take a screenshot of it so it stays on your computer, take a photo with your phone if you want. But here is a question from the interview that you will be asking over and over and over this selection process. So like, let's say you have a camper in your group who is on the autism spectrum and is having a difficult time with an extremely loud environment. How would you support this camper throughout the day's activities? Give concrete examples. That is exactly what it says in the interview. And then here are some, like there's a grading protocol listed easily for you. And then here are answers that Dobby and I have seen from real students in real time. Like these are pulled straight from their notes that the students took. So I would like you to individually grade them. How would you score them based on these answers? And then meet up with your team to see how on track or how far apart you all might be viewing these things. Whatever point, however different your scores are, is a-okay. But we want to be starting these conversations so that way we can try and get on the same page before we start the interview. So again, take a screenshot so you have this to reflect on later. Pause the video now, do it all right now. And then after that, you're trained. You did it. Woo!
Love that.
Amazing. Thanks.